Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where it was today in 1975 that Peter Gabriel left Genesis, leaving them without a lead singer. And nothing happened. I mean that in a good way, because Genesis, of course, carried on and they became even more popular. Now, what are the odds that a singer of a band who would then go on to be one of the most successful, both artistically, critically, and commercially, one of the most successful solo artists of all time. He leaves your band and you become more popular. How the hell does that happen? Is it luck? Not really. I'll tell you what it comes down to. When it comes to the prog rock pantheon, and Genesis are obviously in there at the top, what did they have that differentiated them from the other prog rock bands of the era? And the answer is they approached music from a songwriting perspective first, and everything else followed on from that. And to understand why that is, you have to look at the genesis of Genesis. When the band started, it was the intention of its founders to be sort of Tin Pan Alley songwriters that would make music that others would then record. They never really intended to be a band in and of their own right. But it was the late 60s, and the classic singer, the classic songwriter had given way to both the singer songwriter and to bands that were playing their own music. So they realized that if they wanted to get their compositions out there, they had to play it themselves. And through all of the people that have come and gone in Genesis, the core songwriting duo of Tony Banks, keyboards, and Michael Rutherford, bass and guitar, and bass pedals, of course, that's remained the sole consistent thing in Genesis. And that's why there is such a strong consistency in terms of the writing. Now, of course, everyone in Genesis did write, but the lion's share of Genesis music was either Banks, Rutherford, or both. And you could even argue that among those two, Banks carried the lion's share. And so that's one of the reasons that Genesis continued to have success after their very charismatic lead singer left the band. Now, just what is so special about this songwriting? Well, I would say, first of all, it is the sense of chordality, the way that the musicians, and Tony Banks in particular, uses chords. All of the chord sequences, the chord progressions used in Genesis, they build tension in a manner that's so dramatic, yet so easy on the ear, never really dissonant, always very harmonious. And it builds this tension that results in a sonic narrative. And the other thing that's so unique about the writing, apart from this wonderful sense of chordality, is the fact that they're able to create songs that are cohesive, even though they have many different elements in them that change. It isn't, they've never been satisfied, Genesis, with the sort of verse, chorus, verse, it's always really been about more than that. Suites of music as presented in songs, whether they take up a full side of the album, like Supper's Ready on Foxtrot, or a good chunk of something like, um, for instance, One for the Vine on Wind and Weathering. And so once Peter Gabriel left, they were looking desperately for a new singer because they knew that they could still write and play. All of the musicians, Phil Collins on drums, Steve Hackett on guitar, Mike Rutherford on bass and guitars, Tony Banks on keyboards, they were all still there, but they needed someone to sing the songs. And so they had this infamous wild goose chase where they asked people to audition, and some of them were really bad. And then they just looked to Phil, who had sung a bit of backup vocals, say, well, why don't you do it? And he did it wonderfully. And then the same problem happened again when they went out on tour, and it was Bill Bruford, the wonderful drummer who at that point had been with Yes and King Crimson, would later go on to do many other great projects. He suggested, look, we know each other. I'll sit back there on the drums and you can go out there and lead from the vocal microphone out in front. And that tour went very successfully. And it was captured on film. It's called Genesis in Concert from 1976. Now, although it's a good document, particularly the Supper's Ready section, it's very dark, and maybe that's just because they didn't have enough time or enough of a budget to bring camera lighting that would be friendly for the cameras. But the biggest problem of all is that it's so short. The in concert film that has been out in the public for decades only shows a fraction of the songs played on that tour. And because it was the only tour Genesis did with Bill Bruford, there's a lot of historical value to that. I don't know if you out there know who's got the film negatives. Where are they? Do they still exist? What about the sound? Is there a 2-track master out there somewhere? Is there a multi-track master out there somewhere? Where is this stuff? And if it is out there, can some lawyer be paid to go away so that all of it can be edited together and the full concert can come out? And because it was shot on film rather than video, we can see it in glorious 4K. So I'd love to see that as a Genesis fan. I think many others would too. And they went from strength to strength. The following year, they came out with Wind and Weathering, the second post Gabriel album. Wonderful stuff, my personal favorite. And on that tour, they paired up with a man who would be in the drummer's seat for live gigs till, frankly, the end of Genesis as we knew it. And this was Chester Thompson, wonderful drummer with what a pedigree. Frank Zappa, Weather Report. He played in pit orchestras for The Wiz, a very sort of modern, funky musical. Just what a pedigree. He had started out, of course, as a jazz drummer, played in a lot of R&B bands, and he made sure that the band could continue to thrive with Phil Collins standing up singing. He would be playing the drums, and then for long instrumental passages, they would play the drums together, and they even had a drum duet that got longer and longer every year. And that was the classic Genesis format from the mid 70s up until the early 90s. And it worked really well. But underneath all of it, it was the great songwriting. So much so that Steve Hackett, who was becoming a great songwriter in his own right by the mid 70s, he left the band because he felt that the Banks Rutherford songwriting dictatorship didn't have any room at the inn. I wish he didn't leave. Great guitarist, great guy. I've met him a few times. But it was ultimately Genesis was a band where Banks and Rutherford wrote the songs. And that's why there was consistency when Hackett left, consistency when Gabriel left. And yes, the band did go in different stylistic directions in the 80s, but that wasn't because of members being lost. It was almost in spite of them, because Banks and Rutherford made certain decisions as chairman of the board to change direction ever so slightly, and that's what happened. There's not much more that we ought to read into that. So the lesson is, if you're going to lose your lead singer, make sure that the essence of your band isn't dependent on that singer. That's, for example, why Van Halen worked with two completely different lead singers, because the essence of that band was the songwriting and guitar playing of Eddie Van Halen. Other bands have changed singers too. Jefferson Starship has changed singers. They went from strength to strength, though. Mickey Thomas, wonderful. Journey in their later career went from Steve Perry to someone who was impersonating Steve Perry in the Philippines, Arnel Pineda. And that worked out. So, don't always cry if your lead singer calls it a day. That's a lesson there from the book of Genesis, no less. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.